Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar in education policy here at AEI. Thrilled to have you here for the findings from the 2019 Schooling in America survey. I get the privilege of doing this every year with Paul DeParna and EdChoice, and we're thankful that they came back to AEI this year to give us a look at their results from their survey and a view into public opinion on a wide variety of education issues to see where Americans' views are and where they're changing. We have a pretty simple program today. After this introduction, I'll give the podium to Paul DeParna, who will come up, and I'll introduce him formally in just a minute, and go through the survey results. There's a lot in there, so we're going to give him about 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes to get through a variety of subjects. And then we're going to sit down here with myself and a great panel. Again, you'll have to wait for their introductions when you can match a name to a face. We'll give Paul a couple of minutes to rest his voice while we discuss the results and what they mean for education and education reform together. The event is being live streamed, so welcome to all those who are online. And we will be taking questions later from the audience. For those on the live stream, we have a hashtag that's hashtag Schooling in America. Particularly if you have a question during the Q&A section towards the end, I'll be checking Twitter to see if there are any questions that can come from those watching online. Please silence your cell phones now, and I'd like to welcome up in just a minute here Paul DeParna. He's the Vice President of Research and Innovation at EdChoice. He oversees EdChoice's research projects, and the organization has published more than 100 papers, reports, and briefs over the past decade, including the annual results from the survey. Before joining EdChoice, Paul was the Assistant Director of the Brown Center for Education Policy at the Brookings Institution just next door. So with that, I'll invite Paul up to give us the results of this year's survey.
Well, thanks, Nat. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here at AEI. My name is Paul DeParna, and I'm the Vice President of Research at EdChoice. For those of you who might not be familiar with our organization, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts and commissions research on schooling issues and school choice issues in K-12 education. And we're based in Indianapolis, but the scope of our work can be national, regional. Oftentimes we're focused on a single state's educational environment. And we see it as our job to communicate research, our research and others, to inform and educate policymakers and opinion leaders at local, state levels, as well as here in Washington, D.C. Our organization is also a charter member of the Transparency Initiative with the American Association for Public Opinion Research. And so before I get going, I really do want to take a second and thank Nat and Nate May, Rick Hess, and AEI for hosting our panel again this year. It's always a great time to work with them, and we really enjoy this event and are grateful for that partnership that now I think is in our 6th year that we've been releasing the Schooling in America survey here at AEI. I also want to recognize and credit my co-authors, Drew Catt and Mike Shaw at EdChoice, and also the rest of our team at EdChoice, where this is really an all hands on deck effort to put together this publication and this project, and they've worked very hard over the last few months. And I'm also grateful for the work we do with Braun Research, who has been our survey partner now for more than a decade. And they conducted the phone interviews and administered the online surveys for this poll. And they've been a great partner of ours for a long, long time. So why don't we just jump right in? As Nat mentioned, there are a lot of numbers and figures and charts. And so I'll try not to go too quickly. But hopefully we'll be able to find, there's some interesting findings, and you find some of the questions that we asked this year of interest. And so before reading into the results, it's always good to take a step back to have a better understanding of just how the survey was administered. And so we call this our survey profile. It's in Appendix 1 in our publication. And so we try to be very transparent and provide as much information as we can about our methods. And so it's always helpful to ask, who did we survey? This is a general population survey, so we were able to obtain 1,810 completed interviews, both online and over the phone, with a nationally representative sample of the general public. We also collected 601 interviews online with current public school teachers. And then we oversampled and it collected additional interviews with Generation Z and millennial respondents, so those who were born 1981 and more recently. And so we wanted to better understand some generational comparisons with our results this year. And then we always highlight the results from parents of school-age children, and as part of our sample, we had 435 parents in our survey. And so this survey was conducted over the summer from July 10th to the 31st, so right in the middle of the summer, just a few months ago, so the results are still pretty fresh. And as I mentioned, the survey was conducted both online and over the phone, and so called a mixed mode approach, which is becoming more and more common these days in the polling industry. And then what did we ask about? And so oftentimes we have a standard set of questions we ask year to year, and then we have some special topics that we look at. And so this year, as we always do, we look at parents' schooling experiences and their own preferences. We ask teachers about how they view their profession, how they viewed the recent, in the last couple of years, teacher walkouts and strikes. Who do they trust among K-12 education stakeholders? And then there are these kind of enduring topics, what we call enduring topics in K-12 education. So issues like busing, funding and education spending, standardized testing, and then also this year, for the first time, we asked a couple questions about technology use, and particularly how parents and teachers see their students and children and how they're using technology and what concerns they may have. And then we always ask questions about school choice reforms, which includes education savings accounts, school vouchers, public charter schools, tax credit scholarships. And then, as I mentioned before, we oversampled Generation Z and millennial respondents, so we're able to pull out some of those comparisons across the generations, and we thought there was some interesting data that emerged. So also, it's always helpful to cross-reference and see what others are doing. And so there are two other annual polls on K-12 education issues. PDK released theirs a couple months ago. That's Untitled Chapter, and they've been doing their polling now for, almost 50 years. And so it's in the early 70s they started. And then EdNext was they just released their poll last month. They're in their 13th year. And then one resource I'd recommend is about a year ago, Public Agenda put together a report which was a review of public opinion surveys on K-12 issues, and they really did a nice job synthesizing together different organizations' surveys and polling results on different topics. And so that was about a year ago. So that could be another resource. But it's always helpful to look and see where we all ask about similar topics and issues, but we have different worded questions. The questionnaires are ordered differently. That can all affect responses, so it's always nice to cross-reference. So why don't we jump into the findings? And so, as I mentioned, we always focus and highlight the results around parents and teachers, so we'll look at those first. And we see that on average, there are large majorities of parents who are satisfied with their schooling experiences, no matter what type of school that is. So it could be a public charter school, district school, private school, and homeschooling. And we saw that reasons really varied widely on why they chose and enrolled their children in those different types of schools. And so you can see that things didn't change a whole lot since last year. About 3/4 still are express satisfaction with private schools, public charter schools, and homeschooling. and then 2/3 say the same about traditional public schools. We did see a dip by about 10 points among those who are homeschoolers, and so that was one noteworthy change. And then this is a big table, lots of numbers, but one way to read it is just to look at the dark shaded boxes, and that shows so we asked what were the reasons why they enrolled their children in those types of schools, and you can see how for different types, reasons vary across the types. So for public district schools, it was their assigned school, or it was close in their proximity, and so you saw about half saying giving those reasons, putting those reasons in their top three. You see for private school, it's things like academic reputation, a safe environment, and public charter school, about the same. Academic reputation was high, safe environment, and then particularly among homeschoolers, that safety was the top reason, and really stood out among the reasons for why homeschoolers chose to educate their children. And then parents are much more likely. We always ask, how did not just their schools where their children go, but how do they rate or grade their local area schools, whether they're public, private, public charter. And this is consistent year to year. We see 3/4 of current school parents give an A or B grade to their local private schools, and then about half give A's or B's to local public charter schools, and their local half give A's or B's to the local district schools. So there's a gap there between private and those other school types. And then, those were about experiences, and then we move into preferences. And how do parents feel? What are their privately held preferences about schooling, and where they would see the best way to educate their child? And we see big gaps between what they say over the phone or on this online survey with what actual real world enrollment patterns look like. So if you look at the bottom bar, that reflects the proportions of children that are in. 82% are in public district schools, 5% charter, 10% private school, and 3% are homeschooling. Those are actual enrollments based on government reported data. And then those top two bars, school parents and the preferences of school teachers, you see that compare that the purple, about a third of parents say they would send their child to, the first choice would be a public district school, 42% would send to a private school. So compare that third to what's at the 82% that's the actual enrollment for public district school. You compare their preferences are 4 times more than what we see out there in actual enrollments for private school. So there are these gaps. And the teachers, roughly the same story, but they're more likely to say their district school is the first preference, but you still see close to 40% saying private school. So then we're interested in the results around the current public school teachers. And so I just to ask the audience, are any of you either currently teaching or come from a family of teachers? I'm just curious, because I'd be interested in questions that you might have, or how these either contrast or would compare with your own experience or your family or friends' experiences. So we see that current public school teachers, just like last year, signal a lot of discontent with their profession, and that's as measured by a Net Promoter Score question. And NPS, Net Promoter Score question, is a type of question that is often used to measure, it's one way of measuring brand loyalty or customer engagement, sometimes even employee engagement. And so what we've done is we've adapted that for some of our surveys. And so we've asked this question here of teachers. We've asked previously of state legislators in a survey, active duty service military members. And what we see, the NPS score in the red was -19 for current public school teachers. And that's pretty similar to last year. And then compared to those other surveys, we've seen NPS as high as +41 for legislators and +20 for active duty service members. And that's on a scale of minus 100 to plus 100. And essentially that NPS is the difference between the promoters and the detractors. But it stands out, even the NPS score, and there are critics and skeptics of the NPS score rubric, but just to look at that 24% who are promoters, that was surprisingly low among current public school teachers. But that also kind of jives and with what we see on TV and the internet and recent news with what's been happening in, say, like the Chicago teacher strikes in the recent couple weeks, and earlier this year in Los Angeles, and last year in state capitals, whether it was in Oklahoma, Arizona, North Carolina. So this is pretty consistent with what we're seeing in the news. And then we asked teachers who they trust, and majorities of teachers say that they trust their students and their principals, but only a third say they trust their students' parents or their school boards. And they are the least trustful of those who are far away, departments of education, whether at the state level or at the U.S. Department of Education. And you can see this graphically where the blue lines represent that's where there's been not a whole lot of change since last year, but still an increase in trust for their school principal or their students. And then you see the red lines for the State Department of Education or the U.S. Department of Education. So it appears the further away and the more where the stakeholder, there's just less trust. And then we asked about teacher walkouts and strikes, and teachers said that they hold state governments most responsible for what's going on. And that's actually an increase, and that's a change from last year. And so their focus is at the state level as opposed to even at the district level. And the public, they're more likely to fault school districts more than any other stakeholder. And it appears, compared to last year, that teachers' unions and individual teachers are being viewed as less culpable for these walkouts and these protests. And you can see it's a little bit hard graphically, but you can see the three groupings: teachers, parents, and the general public. And you can see where the lines are going up for teachers, where you see that jump from 56% up to 60, into the 60s, mid-60s. For state government, and so that's where teachers are really focusing their energies, it appears, at least based on our survey results. So we also asked, along these lines, we did a split sample experiment where we wanted to see if a statistic could change opinion about how favorable a respondent would be towards teacher strikes. And so we asked if there was a teacher strike for a 10% pay increase, I'm paraphrasing, to what extent would you support or oppose that action? On that general wording, you can see that 6 out of 10 of teachers, 2/3 of teachers, but 6 out of 10 general public, 6 out of 10 parents said they were supportive. And then we included wording and the statistic on the national average. So we, based on recently reported NCS data, the reported national average was roughly $60,000 for a public school teacher salary. When we included that actually depressed support among the general public and parents, but it increased support among teachers. And so you see that 75% of teachers that said, based on that, including that information, that they would support strikes. So the information matters. And EdNext does this with their polling year to year too, and are a really great resource looking at these kind of split sample or wording experiments as well. So looking at these enduring topics, we see every year we ask about the direction of K-12 education nationally, and about 1/3 of Americans say that K-12 education is heading in the right direction. And that's a 13-point increase actually since 2016. So there's been an increase in recent years, but on the other side, more than half are still saying K-12 is on the wrong track. And this is the trend lines. You can see that red trend line has been pretty sticky, and hovering in the low 60s to the mid 50s this year. But that blue line is ticking up, so that'll be a trend that'll be interesting to follow and see. Focusing on funding, we asked several questions on funding. And so, this is something we see every year. that the public really doesn't have an idea about how much we spend in K-12 education on a per student basis. And surprisingly, they do a better job estimating or guessing private school tuition per student. And that was something new that we did this year. And current public school teachers are even further off in their estimates, which was a little bit surprising. And so what you can see, generally the purple represents the underestimating proportion and the blue represents the overestimating proportion. And the dividing line between the purple and the blue, that's the actual. That's the $12,201 per student statistic from the USDOE. And we can see that 4/5 of the general public are underestimating, and about a fifth, 20%, are overestimating. 21% are overestimating, but 9 out of 10 teachers are underestimating, and 10% are overestimating. And I think the key takeaway from this is to look at where the median response is and the distance to the actual figure. And so the median response of the general public, they said the median response was $5,000 per student, which is less than half of what the actual number is. And then among current public school teachers, they said $4,000 per student. That was the median. And that's a third of where we are. And you can see that the distance between the arrows grows when you're comparing the general public and teachers. And then for private school tuition, as I mentioned a second ago, they're a little bit better at estimating, where the Private School Review, which is an online website service that collects information about private schools around the country, they reported this year that the average was $10,646 for private school tuition. And the median response in our survey was 10,000. So the distance between the median and the reported number was a little bit closer. So we also do a wording experiment about funding and whether it's too high, too low, or about right. And what we learn is when we give the respondents that per student spending statistic, then respondents are less likely to say that public school funding is too low. And so just looking at the blue bars, that's the too low response. And so when they don't have that information, more than half, 54%, say that funding is too low in America's public schools. When they are given that 12,201 statistic, it's 41%. So there's a 13-point change from no information to being given that statistic. And so we ask questions about testing. And more than 6 out of 10 teachers think that too much time is being spent on standardized testing and preparation for testing. And that's compared to roughly about a third who say the same among the general public and parents. So there's a difference, a clear difference between teachers and the general public and parents when it comes to testing. And that's where you can see that just reflected by the red bars. So 36% of the general public, 35% of parents say that testing time and prep is too high, but 62% of teachers would say the same, almost double. So over the summer, there was a lot of attention on busing, at least in the education news media, and that came up in the Democratic presidential debate. I believe it was in June. Joe Biden and I believe it was Senator Kamala Harris were talking about their past positions, current positions around busing, and so this was an issue that was very controversial and a policy that was very controversial in the 70s and through the 80s, but then by the 90s, it started to taper off, and we saw there was polling on this issue quite a bit in the 70s and 80s, and that tapered off in the 90s. And so we looked, and there really hasn't been much polling. So we say, hey, why don't we, it'd be interesting just to see where does the public stand on busing today, and look at how parents feel about it and how teachers feel about it. And it was surprising to see. So we did it in a way that we asked 3 different types of questions with different wording. One was just a pure, do you support or oppose, and I'm paraphrasing, busing children across district lines? And so that could be almost interpreted like public school choice in a very broad sense. Then we added, and then in another version, we added wording that included the purpose. And we said busing for racial and economic integration. And then in a third version, we added the word mandatory, which added another condition to it. And the wording affected the general public and parents, but it really didn't affect the teachers. But the more surprising finding, at least to me and to my colleagues, is that more than 60% of current public school teachers were opposed to busing, no matter how it was worded, and interdistrict busing in general, or with more conditions. And you can see that reflected where that red line represents current public school teachers, and it's fairly stable. And then you see, and it's going across from the more general to the more specific wording. And then you see the increase for the general public and parents and their opposition. And this reflects opposition to busing with that additional wording. So we also asked about technology and any concerns. I'll probably go through this a little bit quickly. I want to be sensitive to time. But we asked teachers and parents about how they view the parents about their own child and children's usage of technology. These teachers, we asked about their students' usage of technology. And it was interesting to see that there are wide gaps really between parents and teachers about how frequently they are worried about the children's use of technology. Teachers were much more worried and expressed a lot more concern than parents. And maybe we could talk about that a little bit on the panel. We're in Q&A. And so we asked, and just generally speaking, the differences between teachers and parents were about 15 to 20 points. So these are really, in terms of how frequently, very often, or extremely often expressing worry or concern about their child or student's technology use. And so we asked about spending too much time in front of screens, spending too much time, of their personal life, putting too much of their personal life online, being harassed or bullied online is a recurring issue, and even the ability, people are worried about the ability to communicate. Maybe too much time can impair the child's ability to communicate with other people, and then also receiving or sending explicit images online. So these kind of things occasionally we see in the news or hear about. And again, teachers a lot more concerned, where at least about 40 to 50% of parents are concerned, but 60 to 70 or more percent of teachers are concerned about these things. So our questions about school choice reforms, I mean, in a nutshell, we didn't see a lot of change since last year, and so there's a lot of support for all types of school choice policies: education savings accounts or ESAs, vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and public charter schools. And then ESAs, when you compare the support for each of those types of policies, ESAs continue to garner the highest level of support. And you can see that here, where in the last few years, that pink line is the ESA support line, and that's kind of taken off in the last few years. But support levels are all 60% and higher, 77% this year for ESAs. And so you can see for support, as I mentioned, 77% support for ESAs. One thing to look at is the margin. And that really tells you the likelihood of support or opposition on a particular issue. And those margins are huge, really, for ESAs, even among current parents and public school teachers. And that's the trend for education. Those are the trends for education savings accounts based on eligibility. And so you've seen that 3/4 support universal ESAs this year. That's more or less unchanged. About half support means tested, and that's up a little bit since 2015. And then for school vouchers, support's at 63% this year. The margin is at 29%, and the margins, interestingly, you see margins 45 points spread for parents, which is really big. It's 1 point for current public school teachers. So that's a difference that stood out among the different types of policies. And then the intensity as well, you actually see things go, the intensity goes in the negative among current public school teachers at -8 points. It's still pretty healthy, pretty large and positive for the general public and parents. And that's the trend for vouchers, pretty consistent in recent years, hovering around the early, low 60s in support. And then tax credit scholarships, support was at 68% this year, 75% among parents. 2/3 of teachers said they supported, and kind of like similar to ESAs, those margins are very wide. And you can see that since 2016, there have been increases in support for tax credit scholarships. And for public charter schools, 64% of the public said they supported charters, 70% of teachers, 70% of parents, 55% of teachers. And the margins, kind of like vouchers, I mean, they tighten a lot for public school teachers. Still positive at plus 10 points, but it's 46 points for parents. So there are some demographic differences we still see on school choice policies, and that's the trend for public charter schools. And then for quickly to go through the generational comparisons, we use Pew Research Center's definitions for generations, and we see that more than 2/3 of Gen Z and millennials were satisfied with their high school experiences. Only 1 of 10 respondents in those two generations said that they were very dissatisfied. And we see that we asked Gen Z particularly what they did in their last year in high school. And something that stood out, there was about close to 40% of Gen Z respondents said they worked 5 hours or more per week in their last year of high school, which kind of stood out a little bit and was higher than we would have thought. And many Gen Z respondents also said that they spent minimal time on a whole range of activities. And you can see the way to, hopefully the easier way to read this table or this chart would be just to look at the blue and the purple, and the blue is more time per week, purple is less time per week. And you can see that, no surprise, socializing, social media, video, TV is pretty high. And then we have the working about 40%, five more hours per week. And then below, you can see they spend a lot less time on sports activities, exercise, even partying. And this is actually a question that was adapted from Pew Research Center's own research. And then we see Gen Z and millennials are a lot more supportive of interdistrict busing, so looking at the issues across those different question versions than Gen Xers and boomers. And you can see how the wording affects the different generations. It goes down with the condition, more specifics, but then it kind of rebounds a little bit for Gen Z and millennials, and so it seems pretty resilient. Where Gen Xers and boomers, the more specific, the more depressed the support is for busing. And then just to quickly wrap up, each generation is most supportive of the ESAs. All the generations of most supportive of ESAs compared to the other types of reforms, and the generational differences appear with respect to vouchers and charter schools. And so you see a lot more support among Gen Z and millennials compared to like boomers and silent generation. And with that, I'll just say thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the panel.
I'm going to welcome up my panel, and Paul, you down here at the end. Thanks for that full presentation. Lots to go over and lots to discuss. I only have 48 questions to get through in the next half hour, so let's get cracking. First, let me introduce our panel. Starting with my right, Kate Turkin is the Managing Director of Client Services at Morning Consult. Previously, she was the Vice President and Head of Youth Insights at Kantar's Consulting Division. She's an expert on custom research and has spent several years studying millennials and Generation Z, which we just heard about. So we're glad to have you here, Kate. Candace, you all know Paul. Candace Pate is the Executive Director for Institutional Advancement at Martin University. Previously, Candace served as the Director of Admissions and Community Partnerships for Providence Cristo Rey High School and Principal of New Heights Academy in Indianapolis. Candace, we're glad to have you as well. And last but not least, Christopher Ruskowski is a Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Previously, Christopher was New Mexico's education secretary under Governor Susana Martinez and joined the administration prior to that as deputy secretary under Hannah Scandera. And Chris is a good friend of AEI, so we're particularly pleased to have him here. Well, there is a lot to talk to kick off with. Paul started off with parents. So Candace, I have a question for you to start out with, sort of on parents. And how your experience as a parent sort of squares with these results. So on the one hand, the results showed a little bit of sunshine as it comes to views on schooling, particularly public schooling, in that the percentage of people that think it's going in the right direction is up more than ever. To a not particularly encouraging 36%, right? 37. Well, I'll have to check my numbers, but
okay.
I'm still not that much more encouraged, Chris. On the other hand, you also have, so that increasing in positive, but you also have some negative sentiments about K-12. Only a full third of parents reported dissatisfaction with their public schools, and half gave A or B grades to their local private school districts. Private preferences kind of back that up. So Candace, just in your conversations with school parents and advocates, how do the findings about satisfaction and preferences and reasons for choosing different kinds of schools, are they consistent with those conversations or maybe different?
They're definitely consistent. I can talk first from my personal experience. I have a daughter in private school and I have a daughter in public school. And you just see a tremendous difference in the offerings when you're paying for your education versus when it is a public school. And I think the greatest thing that you see is just, for example, with my daughter, she brought out the example that Robin, which is my oldest daughter who goes to private school, she says she gets to experience science. I just learn it. And I think that makes a huge difference in why parents are satisfied with your private school education versus your public school. But I'm a product of public school, so I think that the greatest thing is just being able to, now in Indianapolis, we have, I apologize, Paul, I'm trying to remember what IPS schools are called.
Oh, the innovation schools?
Innovation schools. And my daughter attends one of those, so I think that we're very happy with just the changes that IPS is offering with education.
Great. Well, Chris, I want to get your take on this from the sort of the state policymaker perspective.
As you saw, we're very popular.
Yes, put that on. You
in the
are.
data, yeah, 25%.
And your stock is rising.
Yeah,
well, you were in New Mexico. The state
Yeah.
invested a ton in accountability and in transparency, particularly for parents and families.
Yeah.
You did this through New Mexico schoolgrades.com, is that right? NMSchoolgrades?
NMSchoolgrades.com.
What struck you in this about the perceptions of this group of stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul mentioned in his presentation, when the intersection here around accountability, transparency, and then forms of choice, I think we have to recognize that. I think there's some folks out there that I've talked to throughout the years that are huge advocates of choice, huge advocates of options, maybe not as on board for the state also playing a role in terms of regulation and transparency and information. And we got to do both. Because there are many times that throughout the survey, and Paul, I laboriously sort of went through every page, like where when people's awareness and knowledge goes up, then their likeliness to think something is a good thing goes up. And so, and you can look at that around the funding questions, particularly around the questions around like why you make decisions about schools. I mean, in a lot of states in America, I don't even know how a parent would make a decision based upon academic reputation if the data on academic performance is not being made publicly available and accessible. That's certainly what we were trying to do with nmschoolgrades.com, is create a database where folks were not in the dark around how their schools are doing academically, but also some of the other things. I mean, I thought the split, Paul, around proximity, academics, and sort of safety, right? And then you could sort of put in the fourth bucket other things that folks care about. There was a pretty even split there across those things. And so on our platform, nmschoolgrades.com, we had to include information on all of those things because that's what parents and families wanted. But I do think if we keep, I think a lot of right now there is a fear that I have when you look at the way that governors are governing and legislators are governing, that people are going to be more in the dark. That because of some of the pushback around accountability, transparency, testing, which we talked about, that there's going to be less and less information out there for folks to consume. And if there is less and less information out there for folks to consume, I believe that perceptions around choice and charters and options will also start to drift downwards as well if they're not given that information. And so I was encouraged by this idea that more information can actually lead to higher degrees of likability on these things.
Well, that's interesting. And the nice thing about nmschoolgrades.com is that you can just you can just go on your phone and just look at the screen and get all your information there. And Kate, that's what I want to bring us to now, because those last slides showed some pretty worried parents and pretty worried teachers about a bunch of aspects of screen time. Part of this is just overexposure.
Yep.
Part of it is bullying and, sort of cyber dangers and so forth. Is that worry warranted?
Yeah, I think it is and it isn't, right? So we saw in the data that about the same percentage is also spending time socializing with friends or working. So the stereotype of the Gen Zer or the young millennial just sort of holed up in the dark with their phone or with a video game is unfounded. There are certainly some kids who do that all the time, but the majority are not spending their time that way. I think the bigger issue that we see is that when we look at it, a lot of adults are very sort of black and white about technology. It's bad, it's a waste of time, you shouldn't be spending your time there. Where for a lot of these kids who are stressed out, they've got a lot of pressure on them, we're living in a pretty tough world, tough environment right now, that access to the outside world, that access to other friends, that access to content is something that they need. It can be entertaining, it can be informative, and it can be a way to socialize. So instead of framing it up as technology is bad and I'm worried about how the kids are spending their time, thinking about ways to sort of shift that conversation. And you notice in the data that the percentage who spend time at clubs and organizations at schools is pretty low, which then raises the question, well, why aren't those clubs appealing to these kids? What are we missing here? And so I think schools that are embracing technology in new ways, having a team for esports. I just read an article the other day about schools that have started clubs for TikTok, which is one of the biggest apps right now with young people. It's a video app. Those are the things that are going to resonate with them. And at the same time, you can use those opportunities to teach them how to be safe online, how to be smart, how to socialize.
So I promised the panel that I'd get through 3 questions without going into the appendices, but I just went through 3 questions. So I love the appendices in the back. I encourage you to read the report. It is long, but it's got a ton of gold in the appendices. Let me talk about one of the things. Let's just go to right direction, wrong direction in education. 37% is going in the right direction. That's the highest ever. But 56% said it's wrong. So if you take the percentage wrong out of the percentage right, you get a negative 19 margin. But if you look at those margins down the list, you find some interesting variation. So I'm going to give you some, and this is a free-for-all.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in which one resonates. The net that is smaller, this is more positive feelings, are for current parents of school-age children, young people, Asian and Hispanics. The net is about the same for teachers. It's larger for older folks, folks who have a college degree, those who are wealthier, and both black and white respondents. Those latter groups have more negative views about schools. I'm curious, do any of these strike you as interesting variations?
So I think it's pretty consistent with when you do these demographic breakouts. I mean, where, at least in the recent years, and I'm thinking about that public agenda report that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, and where they pulled together, and they had shown that some of these demographics are more positive, relatively more positive, and current school parents tend to be more positive than the national average. Latinos, Asian Americans also tend to be more positive about public schools, and different on different types of questions too, not just this kind of question. So I think it's pretty. There is this pattern that we are kind of seeing, at least the last few years, that there are some of these groups that do kind of go against the grain and have a pretty clearly different point of view on where things are going.
I mean, I'll just say, coming from a state that is 60-70% Hispanic overall, has the largest Hispanic student population in the country. New Mexico sits somewhere around, literally around 65% of our students are Hispanic. And having worked for the nation's first Hispanic governor, Governor Susana Martinez, over the past 4 years, I thought Governor Martinez was always very in touch with what parents and families on the ground felt and what they wanted. And we spent a lot of time in places like Farmington and Gadsden. If you don't know where these places are, Farmington's in the northwest corner, Gadsden down on the border, Deming down on the border, and then obviously places like Albuquerque in the South Valley, where parents and families were dying for more choices, dying for more options. Literally were surrounded by D and F's, traditional public schools that were part of Albuquerque public schools that were D, F, F in the South Valley neighborhood, which is a historic, and by historic, like 400 years historic neighborhoods in New Mexico. And Governor Martinez always had a really good pulse on this, so I'm not surprised by this, because I think it's consistent with some of the other data that like Democrats for Education Reform have also been releasing lately, some of the polling and surveying that DFER has been doing around just how much Hispanic parents and families in particular appreciate choice, want better and more charter schools. 70% of folks in Bernalillo County, which is Albuquerque, believe that the charter sector should be expanded. And that is also a very large, that is the heart in some ways of Hispanic America.
Well, I'll give you one thing that I wanted to pitch to you, Chris. I saved this just for you.
Yeah.
Folks in the Northeast and Midwest has a very small net at about 13 points, and in the West, it's twice as high. So there's twice as negative sentiment in the West.
Yep.
Does that strike you as surprising?
No, I'm not surprised by that. I think, first of all, when you think about the arc of educational improvement, particularly since No Child Left Behind in 2002, the West has often been sort of on the lagging edge of, when people talk about where we are right now in education, they're often talking about like where we are in New York City.
Yeah,
and then like the rest of the country comes along like 7 years later. So some of the conversations that we were having in New Mexico between 2010 and 2018, I was there from 2015 to now, were the conversations that were happening in Chicago and New York between 2006 and 2009. And so I think that for reasons that are concerning, those places get a little bit less attention. They get a little bit less resource. There's a lot less advocacy. We don't have the kind of parent advocacy and choice advocacy that other places east of the Mississippi have.
I wanted to chime in on that, in that I think that there is an uprise in positivity because there are options now. The options haven't always been available. And I think I work with a lot of low-income families, so you hear that they're happy that they now get an option to send their child to a private school. And working with Providence Cristo Rey, the average family income was like $30,000. So you're dealing with a family of 4, 5, 6, 7 with $30,000. So they're typically having to deal with their neighborhood school that may be a D or a F. So having the option to go to a private school and receive a quality education makes a big difference.
Difficult to be optimistic without choices.
Right.
Right. Very difficult, and I think a lot of places out west don't have those choices.
So I want to shift gears to the teacher walkouts and strikes. One of the interesting things, so we've had a lot of action over that the past couple of years, but most of the action was in 2018, right? That's when we had sort of Red for Ed was born, started in West Virginia, and really caught fire in a number of places. But last year you had a similar question, and you didn't see sort of the responsibility for walkouts and teacher movements being particularly attributed to states. No. And then over this last year, where there's sort of been less action, all of a sudden you see a spike where they're saying, yeah, it's the state government, it's the Raskowskis and those guys that deserve it. Paul, how do you read that change?
That's a great question. I wonder if it's just, kind of the pace of the penetration of the awareness of these strikes and protests, and so it's taken a while. Although I mean, among teachers too, I mean, they clearly the change from last year to this year is focused more on state government, and so. I mean, I at least based on like what I read, I mean, there's still this heightened awareness among teachers and perhaps now more among the general public of what happened last year, mostly like in state capitals, I would say, and focused on the legislatures. And this year it's been a little bit more localized in urban areas like Chicago or LA. So I think, maybe there's a little bit of a lag, or it just takes time for that kind of information or awareness to kind of spread.
I think too, you're seeing that there are so many young people right now who are really disenfranchised with the government, and they have seen their own support for walkouts, whether it's for gun safety or whether it's for the environment. They're seeing traction from that, and so then they are giving their teachers that same permission to do that as well. And a lot of those conversations are happening at home, so some of the kids' views on that are actually rubbing off on the parents, and you're probably seeing that at play there too.
Related to this, there's this question about, how many of you would support teachers walking out for a 10% raise? And everybody's pretty much in the same ballpark. And then when you put the actual teacher's salary, they make $60,000. What do you think? Teacher support goes up, and everybody else's goes down,
Right.
which is a little puzzling. But my question isn't, are you puzzled? My question is, what does that tell you about how the public values teachers?
I think it's complicated. I think there is a lot of support out there. So first of all, I think it's fair to say, and I don't know if Paul would agree, that a lot of the mainstream media and coverage that you read, whether it's about these 5 states or about teacher perception in general, is heavily influenced by the big teachers union machines that have a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of influence, and a lot of access, not just to the political machinery, but also to the media, and have the resources to spread a message, to get a message out there, to support candidates, to run issue ads. So if there is a fight for the hearts and minds of the public, it's certainly true the teachers unions are engaged in that fight for the public's hearts and minds, as they should be. That's part of what their members are paying them to do, but they are engaged in that. And I think that makes the whole thing for me complicated, because your average teacher that's teaching gets a lot of their information from their local chapter, and I think your average watcher of TV and the news is getting their information from their local chapter or affiliate. And so it's a sort of a clarion call for needing more sources of information when people are sifting through what's true and what's not. It's also true that we're paying our teachers about 20-25% less than other developed countries, particularly at the starting salary level. And if I'm getting that number wrong, Nat, I'm sure you'll tell me. Like we're underpaying our starting teachers in relation to other developed nations, other nations that are lapping us, and so it is fair to say that starting salaries should be higher if we want to be more competitive. And folks like me and Governor Martinez, we raised salaries by $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 during our time there. Didn't have walkouts, et cetera, because we were every year raising starting salaries, trying to close that gap between New Mexico and neighboring states, which were now the highest in the region, but also New Mexico and the broader country and the broader economy. But then what makes it even more complicated is that the public has now seen time and time again, salaries go up, resource go up. I mean, New Mexico was a $2 billion system 15 years ago. Today it's a $3.5 billion system. And then they don't see the schools and the system getting better.
Yeah.
Right? They see more adults getting hired. They see the student-teacher ratio going down. It has gone down dramatically over the last 30 years. They see more technology in the building. But as a result of that, it does not, the public is saying, where's the ROI?
Right.
So folks are willing to go to bat for the resources, and then a couple more years down the road, they want to see that the schools have gotten stronger. And when they don't see that, or when they learn how much more resources there, it's not $5,000 per kid, as the median person thinks in the survey, it's $12,000 per kid. They're like, well, wait a minute. What if we went to $20,000 per kid? Would my kid's school be better? And I don't think the average member of the public feels like the answer to that question is yes. And that's where it gets really complicated, I think.
Well, let me throw in something else and then ask the others to join in here. You know, it is very interesting, the median guesses on how much we spend were pretty far off for public schools, right? Not 12,200, they were at 5,000. And if you work there, they were at 4,000, right? That's not good guessing. For private schools, they were pretty close. They were within $600 at 10,000 compared to 10,600. So it sounds like people sort of know how much private school spending, but they don't. And the reason that I suggest that is that if you compare, they think that private schools cost twice as much as public schools, when in fact they cost about 13% less, tuition to total spending.
Yeah.
So my question for the whole crew is, how does this misapprehension of how much things cost affect folks' views on education and what we might let people do with it?
I think it's because of what you see. I mean, when you walk into the public school and you walk into the classroom, you walk into the building, some of them dilapidated, you can't understand possibly how they could be spending that much money on education for my child at that location versus walking into my daughter's private school. It looks like I'm walking into like an Ivy League school, honestly. And so if I gave the perception or if I considered what the parents are talking about, it's because of what they see. I mean, they don't have any idea of where the money's being spent. It doesn't look like the money's being spent towards their child's education just because visibly, and then what they see in return, like what they're getting or the growth and development that they see from their child. Like I get progression reports from my child with her private school. I see the growth from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. I mean, and you don't get that with the public school. So I think that's how that came about, but that's just my personal.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the first year we asked about the private school tuition, and so, and I think we were talking about this on the panel a little bit earlier about the need for transparency, and so I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface, but look at comparing the responses on the public per student spending and the private school tuition, and I think there could be a lot more research or done about just price signaling, and so. I'm speculating, but are private schools and the private sector somehow signaling or more effectively communicating the price of education than we are on the public sector side? And it'll be interesting to see with the Every Student Succeeds Act being implemented, and I'm sure
the school level transparency.
And that's built into the law, and I think the implementation. I'm not as familiar with it, but it'd be interesting to see if that can have any impact or to nudge those medians a little bit.
But I would just say I would say it's more simple. I would say, while folks may not know, nor do I think it's maybe even fair to ask them, what's the per pupil expenditure in your system, may not be even a fair, it's interesting, but it's not like I expect them to know that. Right. What they do understand is when an elected official says we need to triple or quadruple Title I, for example, or when they say we need to increase education spending by $1 billion, and then they do that, and then 4 years later, the system isn't that much better, or their kid's school isn't that much better. That, to me, is the fundamental driver here, because when you go through a period of austerity, like a lot of states did post-recession, and then the schools sort of stay where they are, then people are like, oh, well, yeah, we went through a period of austerity. But then when you jack up the budget by $1 billion and the schools stay where they are, then the pendulum swings back. It's like, oh, we just put in $1 billion and the schools haven't gotten that much better. So to me, it's much more simple around what politicians are promising versus then what happens.
Yeah, it's also interesting to note that when you put out a figure like $12,200, people are saying, "Wow, that's a lot of money." You could convert that to days though, and you could say it's $60 a day, y'all. That's how much we spend for your kids' school, and all of a sudden it seems a little bit more like a bargain. That's just my perspective. I'm going to go to the audience for questions in just a minute, so sort of square them up. But I can't, and I hope we'll get some questions on school choice because I can't let the busing thing go. I'm just really interested in it. And I'm interested because every time, education folks watch one of these presidential debates, they just hope a question comes up on education, and who knew it would be busing, right? Of all the questions. But I'm just going to throw this out there. A 50-50 split, how do you interpret that? What do you draw from a 50-50 split on intra-district busing?
Well, so that's based on the general wording, and so, I mean, if I recall, so Gallup, they had tracked, but public opinion on busing for a while, and if I recall, I mean, it was right around that 50-50, 55-45, when busing was much more, in the news and being debated at school boards or controversial, and so it seems like public opinions. I mean, it's pretty resilient, and so this is years later, and we're still at about 50-50, but it was surprising to me to see how the additional wording would affect, at least among parents and the general public. And it didn't have any effect on the teachers, and which tells me that the wording didn't matter, how it was being implemented didn't really matter. And I mean, just my own, kind of thinking out loud. I mean, I just think that, in my talking with friends who are teachers, family who are teachers, there's kind of a natural, perhaps healthy skepticism of, policy making, broad policy, like sweeping policy, whether it's transportation or other types of policies coming from, whether it's at the board, school district level or state level. No offense, but because the classroom is there is a sanctuary, and so.
Well, it's also interesting that it said for integration and then mandatory for integration, but it seemed like the integration was the scary word, not the mandatory, right? It seemed like mandatory made some differences for some folks, but it really just dropped to the other. Kate, just real quick before we go to the audience, sort of the Gen Z folks and the millennials, they seemed a little bit more down with the busing. Does that surprise you?
No, I mean, one, it's a generation that both generations most likely haven't experienced it previously the way Xers or Boomers may have, so you have your own experiences to reflect on. But I think for Gen Z and millennials, they're generations that generally are very focused on equality, focused on inclusion, focused on diversity. So it makes sense even that with them, when you add mandatory, the numbers actually pop back up because all of a sudden it's saying, oh, this is mandatory for everybody. We're not picking and choosing who gets to do this. This is for everybody, and so that equality piece actually makes sense why that pops back up for them.
Can I just think, I mean, keep an eye on places
briefly, because we got to let these people in.
Keep an eye on places like San Antonio, right, that are pursuing integration, choice, and quality sort of project and program management concurrently as a means to improving student outcomes in college and career readiness. San Antonio and Superintendent Martinez down there are trying to pursue those things. I think what I picked up on, Paul, if I'm not wrong, is sort of pursuing integration as the means and the ends rub some folks the wrong way in the question.
So I want to open it up to the audience. Again, if you're watching online, you can send me a question with #SchoolingInAmerica. We have two rules here at AEI when we take questions. The first is just give your name and your affiliation, and the second one is ask a question. So do I have questions from the audience?
On the issue of the discrepancy, I guess, in the cost of private education versus public education, how much of that do you think is based on the fact that everybody knows that the private school charges this much tuition, and that's a cost, but the public school is free as far as the parents are concerned, and how much does this influence some of those numbers that you presented, do you think?
Yeah, I think I think quite a bit. I mean, I think it goes back to what we were just saying a few minutes ago. I suspect the parents do have a better sense of what how private schools cost, and the pricing mechanism there may be more effective. And with public schools are viewed as free, and you have to do a lot more digging to learn about how resources are being allocated, and attend, if not attend school board meetings, listen, watch a webcast or, podcast or whatever, and the board brief, to really actually see what those numbers are. So it requires a lot of work. Hopefully that improves and it gets easier with perhaps the ESA implementation years forward, but we'll see.
I think there's also so much in the media around teachers having to pay for their own supplies. And that picks up every year right around back to school. You see it on social media, you see it in GoFundMe's, that teachers aren't getting the resources that they need, so they're having to dip into their own wallets to do that. So it's not surprising that that number is, that people are underestimating that number.
Yeah, I can remember when I was in school, and some of my friends were in private school, and I asked that question, gee, how come I'm in this? And the answer I got was, it was free.
Right.
So one of the questions from the audience came through Twitter was, how is it that teachers trust union leadership more than they trust their parents? That's an interesting contrast. And also the trust that they have the most is for school principals, which I find heartening. But where it's changed, and comment on this how you will, the two measurable increases over the past year are for union leadership and for students. Thoughts?
I think that the union leaders have a greater understanding of what they're actually going through. So you build a trust and a relationship with that person who's going to fight on your behalf. The parents are just kind of winging it. And so having more trust in parents to actually accomplish what it is that they need to get done, I think but that's just.
What?
Go ahead, Paul.
Oh, no, I was and to follow up that, there have been some wins, in the last couple of years when it comes to collective bargaining and these big, pay increases, whether at the state level or district level. And so even if it's not their own district, they're hearing about it, through their social network, their professional networks or in the news. And so maybe that I am speculating, but maybe that affects, some of the positive.
That's absolutely right. I think their union leadership is willing to go to war for them, and for those of us that have spent time inside, I spent time in Dover, Delaware, and then Santa Fe, New Mexico, that they are sleeping in the legislature, and they are there every morning when you wake up, and they're there every night when you leave, and they are camped out in the stairwells, and you can't walk 5 feet around an education committee without being met by their voice and the force of the membership they have behind them, and so for the teacher that's teaching every single day to know they have that advocate, and if they don't have another teacher organization or another outlet for that, then I think it's true. But I also think that put more responsibility on your elected officials at the federal and state level. I think we're going to continue to be unpopular.
You're coming in pretty low.
Yeah, we're coming in low. And I think we have to just sort of embrace that because there's not a lot. The things that you would do to raise that number from 25 to 35 would be being sort of rah-rah-y, and you're not probably going to do that in a 4-year cycle. And so I think you have to embrace the role sometimes of being the bad guy, of being the tough guy, and positioning the architecture of the system for those that, and I'd consider state and federal leaders sort of be architects, educational architects of the broader system, and put the parents and families at the center of that architecture. And if you put parents and families at the center of that architecture, then over time, actually state and federal is going to probably become more popular, but only over time. It's not like you're we put nmschoolgrades.com out there, and 25,000 parents and families went to it within the first month, and now they like the State Department. Yeah. It's like a really gradual, and then eventually maybe one day parents and families oh, okay, I see. The system is designed around my family's needs, not around inside the system actors' needs.
And just seeing some increase in positivity in regards to education, I think would make the difference. Yeah. You hear all the negative things, and so it's kind of well, what is the state doing on my behalf? Yeah. Fair. No offense to you.
No, none taken. None taken.
And something, just thinking, it's something maybe we'd like to do maybe next year is to look at maybe some of these generational differences too, and see where Gen Z and millennials, how they view, labor and union activity, but we just don't dive that deep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting to look at sort of the time spent, and you can look at that as a glass half full or half empty, right? They spend as much time socializing with their friends as they do on social media, or they spend as much time on social media as they do socializing with their friends. The thing that I'm sort of interested in is the huge difference in teacher concern and parent concern. Both are concerned across the board with sort of social media use and screen use. Teachers are much more concerned.
Yeah.
I wonder about your thoughts on whether this is a concern grounded in dang kids these days coming from the teachers, or that the teachers have sort of a comparative view that parents don't often have. So they might say, no, this is increasingly a problem.
Yeah, I mean, teachers obviously have a much bigger sample size to pull from. Many of them who have been working for a while can see shifts and patterns in the behavior of the kids. So I think there's a degree of truth there. I do think there's also, though, teachers all day long, you're battling against the cell phone. You're trying to get them to pay attention. You're battling it day in, day out. So I think some of that is also, some of it's grounded in reality, some of it's probably also, it's just a bigger source of frustration. You have longer hours and more kids to deal with than parents. You're at home and it's a sample size of 1 to 5, and there's just fewer moments where you're really fighting that battle.
I think I would say, no, go ahead.
No,
Guinness.
I was just going to say the same thing. I think that oftentimes, too, as a parent, we're working all day. We get off work. We go home. It's like dinner, do this, keep it moving. So it's not that we don't care. It's just that the energy is probably not poured into even worrying about that. I think that if they realized it was such a big issue at school, then I think that we would, in turn, respond different to the whole technology thing. After you work a long day, just as a mother, I think it's the last thing that you think about.
Well, and we hear kids say all the time, I wish my parents would put down their phone. I wish they'd shut down the laptop. I wish they'd put away the tablet. So
Or my spouse.
yeah, exactly. So it's kind of hard to discipline that when you're
I
also
hear that.
guilty
I don't
of
say
it.
it.
When we did focus groups in Albuquerque with parents and families, they consistently said we want to see more technology. And I think what parents are saying is they're living in the world, out in the real world, driving to work every day, and they're seeing the way that technology is transforming the real world. So they're thinking, because technology is transforming the real world, we better get more technology into schools because I want my kid to be prepared for that real world. But the teachers are saying, I don't need my kids to be on a laptop in order for them to master the 4th grade math objective. There's nothing that demonstrably helps. So in the schools, parents want more technology, so therefore, put a laptop in every kid's hands, and the objective for the day is kids will be able to multiply double-digit numbers and fractions, and the teacher's like, we got to integrate technology into this.
Yeah, less may be more.
Right, so they're being forced to do it.
Less may be more. A question over here.
Hi, Julie Squire from Bellwether Education Partners. Thank you for this survey, which is fantastic every year. I'm curious, looking at this survey next to the data from the EdNext survey to take us back to choice and charter schools for a second. The numbers for support here are different than it is in the EdChoice, not by a lot, but the numbers are different, and they're different from a majority to across that 50% threshold. And I'm curious how you think about the comparison between surveys, or how you think about those differences.
No, that's a really good question, because we do. So the EdNext poll, they ask their charter school and other choice questions differently than we do, and so that's not to beat a dead horse, but that's why I think it is helpful to cross-reference these different polls, because we do ask questions differently, and even the responses are different too, and so. And so in some ways, I kind of see that the gap between our positive on, say, charters and, say, the EdNext poll's positive on charters. It's almost like a bound, range that we can, have a lot even more confidence in. And so I can't remember the exact number. I think it was this year for EdNext, it was about 54% or 52% around there supporting of charters, and ours was 64. And so, but they still, the general message and takeaway is that they're more likely, public's more likely to be supportive now.
I want to pile on to Julie's question. We have pretty high support across the board for these choice initiatives. It's sort of interesting the patterns among them. My question is, for folks who are really interested in pushing choice and increasing these choice programs, do we think that these responses on these polls indicate the kind of sort of fire in the belly support that you need to make change on the ground, as opposed to, sort of free votes in favor of?
Yeah.
I'm trying to get the panel's read on how much support does that support actually indicate?
I looked at Chris.
Yeah, I was encouraged. I think that I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, Nat, so bear with me. But I think that fire in the belly advocacy does move hearts and minds. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but it does. But I think that choice advocates need to be careful about advocating for choice in isolation, and I think they run into some problems on that sometimes. And Paul, I don't know anything about don't know enough about the Indiana landscape to be dangerous, but as a policymaker who's worked for a D and an R, if you're sitting there and someone's coming in a room and they're sort of just advocating for choice, options, outside of the context of other things, whether it be funding or accountability or transparency or teacher quality, I think that can be problematic, and I think that's the way forward is fire in the belly but also a huge dose of caring about the other things around it as well.
Yeah. I think students in particular are very results driven. They're pretty pragmatic. It's show me why this is working. And so if you're looking for student support for choice, it's all around, it's not choice for the sake of it, but it's choice because we know that it works better. And obviously those case studies take time to build, but that's what's going to get Gen Z support while they're students now, but then as they actually age into adulthood and become parents themselves.
And I suppose they're the future of
They are
these
the
surveys.
future.
So, I only have about 25 more questions, but we're out of time. So I'd like to thank you all for attending, and those online. We have a nice reception outside afterwards. So those who were satisfied to come through online next time, come to AEI and sit with us for the conversation. And I'd very much like to thank Paul and EdChoice and our fantastic panel.
Thanks, Nat.
Thank you, Nate.